They say the stock market is a gamble, but I've always treated it like a war. My name is Patricia Thompson, and I didn't just lose my portfolio, I lost my mercy. I thought a single night with a monster would be my exit strategy. I didn't realize it would be the most profitable IPO of my life. 1 month ago, I was the golden girl of Wall Street. I had $1 billion portfolio, a reputation for being untouchable, and a mentor who called me his greatest asset. Then, Marcus Sterling liquidated my life. He didn't just fire me, he stole 10 years of my intellectual property and left me to take the fall for his own fraud. He expected me to disappear into a jail cell or a quiet grave. He didn't expect me to walk into the darkest corner of the underground with a flash drive full of his secrets. I didn't go to the police, and I didn't go to the press. I went to Min Soo Jinwoo, the ghost king of the Korean Mafia, a man whose portfolio is written in blood and whose hand on a trigger is more reliable than any market trend. I thought I was selling my soul for a clean escape. Instead, I found the only man in the world who looks at me and sees a partner, not a pawn. This is the story of how I stopped playing by the rules of men who steal and started reigning with a man who conquers. If you're ready to see how a night with a monster becomes $1 billion hostile takeover, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Trust me, the return on this investment is gonna be lethal. Now, let's get into the day the ticker tape ran red. The digital clock on my bedside table glowed 5 a.m., but I was already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed competence and a pair of Louboutins that sounded like a war march against the marble floors of Sterling & Associates. Today was the day. After 18 months of navigating the shark-infested waters of high-stakes trading, the Aegis Fund was finally ready to go live. It was my baby, a $1 billion portfolio built on my sweat, my proprietary algorithms, and my refusal to sleep. I pulled up to the glass and steel monolith in Manhattan's financial district, the morning sun reflecting off the windows like 1,000,000 sharpened blades. I stepped out of my car, my heels clicking with a steady rhythmic confidence. I had done everything right. I had stayed late, worked twice as hard as the Ivy League legacy hires, and turned Marcus Sterling's failing firm into a powerhouse. I was his golden girl, his greatest asset. I reached the heavy glass doors of the lobby and pressed my keycard against the electronic reader. Beep, beep. A dull red light flashed. I frowned, adjusted my bag, and tried again. Beep, beep. Problem, Miss Thompson? I looked up to see the morning security guard, a man I'd greeted every day for 3 years, looking at me with an expression that wasn't friendly. It was pity. My card seems to be acting up, Frank. Can you buzz me through? I'm sorry, Patricia, he said, his voice low. Orders from the top. Your access has been revoked. A cold prickle of unease crawled up my spine. Revoked? That's impossible. I'm the lead on the Aegis launch. It goes live in 3 hours. Call Marcus. Mr. Sterling is the one who gave the order, Frank replied, looking away. He said if you showed up, I was to hand you this. He pushed a thick manila envelope through the narrow slot in the security desk. My hand stayed steady as I took it, but my heart was beginning to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tore it open right there in the lobby. It wasn't a memo. It was a termination notice. Effective immediately, your employment with Sterling & Associates is terminated for cause. Allegations of corporate espionage and the unauthorized siphoning of client funds. I stopped breathing. Corporate espionage? Siphoning funds? I hadn't taken a dime that wasn't my bonus, and every line of code in the Aegis Fund was my own intellectual property. This wasn't just a firing, it was a hit job. I need to speak with him, I said, my voice dropping an octave, gaining that dangerous edge that usually made traders back down. Now! He's already in the boardroom, Patricia, with the board of directors and the SEC investigators. The world tilted on its axis.
Marcus hadn't just stolen my work, he was using me as a human shield for his own irregularities. He was liquidating my life to save his empire. I didn't argue, I didn't scream. I turned on my heel and walked back to my car, my mind racing faster than a high-frequency trading bot. I pulled out my laptop and tried to remote into my private server, the one where I kept the backups of my algorithms. Access denied. Account deleted. I tried my personal bank account. Balance $0. Account frozen pending investigation. He was thorough. He had erased me. In the span of 10 minutes, Marcus Sterling had taken 10 years of my life and turned it into a weapon against me. I sat in the driver's seat, the silence of the car feeling like a tomb. I could feel the tears threatening to prick at my eyes, the crushing weight of betrayal by the man I had trusted as a mentor. But then I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My gaze was steady, my posture was upright. I wasn't a victim, I was a strategist, and a strategist knows that when the market crashes, you don't panic, you pivot. Marcus thought he had taken everything. He thought I was a girl who played by the rules of a system he owned. He forgot one thing. I knew where all his bodies were buried because I was the one who had organized the graveyard. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, unbranded black flash drive. It didn't contain my portfolio. It contained the shadow ledger, the real records of Marcus's offshore dealings, the ones he thought I was too loyal to ever look for. I didn't need a lawyer. I didn't need the police. I needed someone who didn't care about the rules. I put the car in gear and turned away from the financial district, heading toward a part of the city where the buildings didn't have names on them. If Marcus wanted to play dirty, I was going to introduce him to the man who invented the game. It was time to make the most dangerous investment of my life. It was time to find the Ghost King. The transition from the glass towers of Wall Street to the neon-drenched shadows of the meatpacking district felt like descending into a different circle of hell. My bank account was a desert of zeros, but I still had one credit card Marcus hadn't managed to flag, a high-limit boutique card I'd kept for emergencies. This qualified. I walked into a high-end atelier on Fifth Avenue with the posture of a woman who owned the street, even as the plastic in my purse felt like a ticking time bomb. I didn't look at the price tags. I looked for a weapon. I found it in a deep off-shoulder red dress that clung to my frame like a second skin, the color of a closing bell bloodbath. It was elegant, refined, and projected a quiet defiance that screamed, I wasn't afraid of the dark. When the clerk swiped the card, I didn't blink. The transaction cleared with a soft chime, leaving me with exactly $42 to my name and a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. By midnight, I was standing in front of the Obsidian Gate. There was no sign, only a heavy iron door guarded by two men who looked like they were carved out of granite. This was Min-Soo Jin-woo's territory. In the corporate world, Min-Soo was a myth, a ghost king who supposedly laundered the city's darkest money through shell companies and shadows. In this world, he was the law. The guards stepped forward, their eyes scanning my silk-wrapped frame with clinical coldness. Invitation only, the larger one grunted. I didn't flinch. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small, unbranded black flash drive. I held it between two fingers like a poker chip. Tell Min-Soo that a ghost from Sterling & Associates is here to offer him a seat at a table he's been trying to break for 5 years. Tell him Patricia Thompson has his rival's offshore ledgers, and I'm not leaving until we discuss the dividends. The guards exchanged a look. The mention of the ledgers acted like a skeleton key. One whispered into a lapel mic, waited for a beat, and then stepped aside, pulling the heavy door open.
The mezzanine inside didn't smell like cheap gin and desperation. It smelled of expensive oud, aged whiskey, and danger. The music was a low, thrumming bass that vibrated in my marrow.
Men in sharp, dark suits watched me from velvet booths, their gazes heavy with curiosity and predatory intent. I ignored them all, my gaze fixed on the private mezzanine at the back of the room. There, sitting in a throne-like leather chair, was the man himself. Min-soo Jinwoo was exactly as the whispers described, tall, muscular, and radiating a terrifyingly controlled power. He wore a black suit jacket open over a bare chest, revealing intricate tattoos that snaked across his collarbone like warnings. His dark hair was styled with surgical precision, and his features were so sharp they looked lethal. He was perfectly still, a predator who didn't need to move to prove he was the most dangerous thing in the room. As I climbed the stairs to the mezzanine, the air grew thick with a sudden, suffocating tension. 2 more enforcers moved to block my path, but Min-soo raised a single scarred hand. They vanished into the shadows instantly. I stopped inches away from him. Up close, his eyes were unreadable, black pools of ice that seemed to calculate my net worth and my expiration date in a single glance. I stood my ground, my posture upright, my gaze steady and serious. We locked into a charged stare, the space between us vibrating with a mutual attraction that lacked any trace of warmth. "You have a death wish, Patricia Thompson," he said. His voice was a rich, dark baritone that felt like velvet over gravel. "Walking into my house with a drive you stole from Marcus Sterling. Do you know what I do to thieves?" "I didn't steal it," I replied, my voice unwavering, despite the fact that my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I built the systems that generated it. It belongs to me. Marcus just forgot that when you steal from a strategist, she doesn't go to the police, she finds a bigger shark." I set the flash drive on the small marble table between us. I didn't sit down. I wasn't there for a drink. "That drive contains the keys to every laundered dollar Marcus has moved for your competitors in the last fiscal year," I said. "It's the greatest investment opportunity you'll ever see. I want my life back, and I want Marcus in the dirt. I provide the brains, you provide the muscle. Do we have a deal, or did I waste a very expensive dress?" Min-soo leaned forward, the movement slow and predatory. He didn't look at the drive, he looked at me, his intense gaze lingering on the steady pulse at the base of my throat. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I don't care about the money, Patricia," he whispered, standing up to bridge the final inch of space between us. "But I've been looking for a queen who knows how to play the long game. Let's see if you survive the night."
Min-soo's expression shifted, the predatory smirk deepening into something more intrigued, more dangerous. He picked up the black flash drive from the table, turning it over in his large, scarred hand. "You're talking about high-stakes corporate sabotage. If I use this, the fallout won't just hit Marcus. It'll trigger a landslide on Wall Street. Why should I trust a woman who was, until yesterday, the crown jewel of the enemy's camp? Because the crown jewel has been shattered, and I'm the only one who knows how to put the pieces back together into a blade," I said, stepping even closer, closing the final gap until my breath fanned across his skin. "I don't need you to trust me. I need you to value me. Look at that drive. It doesn't just have numbers. It has the routing pass for his ghost accounts, the ones he uses to pay off the very people who are currently hunting you. I'm giving you his head on a silver platter, Min-soo. All I ask for is the seat next to you while we watch it roll." He was silent for a long moment, the intensity of his gaze calculating the risk versus the reward. I could see the struggle in him, the instinct to dismiss me as a beautiful distraction, warring with the recognition of a fellow predator. The power struggle between us was electric, a silent negotiation where neither side was willing to yield an inch of ground. "You speak of dividends and investments as if we are in a boardroom," he whispered, his hand finally closing around the drive, and then, almost as an afterthought, his thumb brushed against my cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, and sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated tension through my body. But this isn't Wall Street. There are no bailouts here. If you fail me, there is no bankruptcy court. There is only the silence of the East River. If I were afraid of the silence, I would have stayed in my office and waited for the police. I didn't come to you for a bailout. I came for a merger. Min-soo let out a slow breath, the coldness in his eyes finally flickering with a spark of something that looked dangerously like respect. He stepped back, the sudden distance feeling like a loss of gravity. He pocketed the drive and gestured toward the shadows where his enforcers waited. A merger, he repeated, the words tasting like a new kind of power on his tongue. Very well, Patricia Thompson, you've bought yourself a seat at the table, but don't think for a second that this night is over. You've shown me your mind. Now let's see if your heart can handle the volatility of my world. He turned away, but I knew the trade was made. I wasn't an employee anymore, and I wasn't a victim. I was the greatest investment Min-soo Jin-woo had ever made, and before the sun rose, I was going to make sure Marcus Sterling knew exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a hostile takeover. The heavy iron doors of Min-soo's private quarters closed with a finality that signaled the end of the world I knew. This wasn't the club anymore. There were no flashing lights and thrumming bass to mask the danger. Here, in the silence of his inner sanctum, the air smelled of old parchment and expensive bourbon. It was the smell of a man who didn't just spend money, but controlled the flow of it. Min-soo poured 2 fingers of amber into a crystal tumbler, his movements fluid and precise. He didn't offer me a glass. Instead, he sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian and gestured for me to stand before him. You call yourself a strategist, Patricia, but most people in your position are just good at reading spreadsheets. He slid a tablet across the desk. It wasn't the drive I had given him. It was a live feed of a global shipping manifest, a chaotic web of moving parts and fluctuating prices. The port of Busan is currently under a soft lock by a rival faction. I have 3 cargo ships carrying a quarter of my annual revenue sitting in the harbor. If they move, they're seized. If they stay, they rot. You have 10 minutes to tell me how to move them without firing a single shot. I felt the heat of his gaze on me, a physical pressure that demanded I blink, but I didn't. I picked up the tablet. My fingers moved with the familiar grace of a woman who had mastered the art of the impossible trade. This was the test. He wasn't looking for a lover. He was looking for a weapon.
I didn't look at the ships. I looked at the insurance underwriters. I looked at the fuel futures. I looked at the port authority's debt ceiling. The ships don't move, I said, after 3 minutes of silence. I looked up, meeting his unreadable black eyes. You don't fight the blockade. You short the shipping company that owns the port's primary tugboat fleet. Use your influence to leak a rumor of a labor strike in the next hour. The stock will plummet. When the port authority's credit rating dips, you buy their debt. By midnight, you don't just own the ships, Min-soo, you own the port. The rivals aren't blockading you anymore. They're trespassing on your property. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Min-soo leaned back, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. The dangerous smirk returned, but this time it held a flicker of something that looked like true hunger. Most men would have tried to bribe the captain, he whispered. You just liquidated an entire infrastructure. He stood up, walking around the desk with the slow, predatory grace of a man who had seen his greatest investment finally pay off. He stopped so close that the heat of his body was a silent invitation, a physical challenge to the intellectual one we had just completed. The sexual tension was no longer a distraction. It was the fuel for the fire we were both building. He reached out, his hand sliding into the curls at the nape of my neck, tilting my head back until I was forced to look at the raw power in his face. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, a slow, deliberate movement that made my breath hitch. "You're a dangerous woman, Patricia Thompson," he whispered. "You don't just want to win, you want to rewrite the rules of the game." "I don't play games I can't win," I replied, my voice a low, steady defiance. "And I don't invest in men who are afraid of a partner who can keep up." He didn't kiss me. Instead, he pulled me closer, his hand tightening slightly in my hair, not to hurt, but to claim. It was a night of intense psychological warfare, a dance of two predators realizing they were cut from the same lethal cloth. He tested my brilliance, my resolve, and my capacity for ruthlessness, and with every answer, the distance between us vanished. By the time the moon began its descent, the one-night stand had transformed. It wasn't about sex, though the air between us was electric with the promise of it. It was about the realization that together we were an apex predator. Marcus Sterling had tried to erase me, but in this room, under the gaze of the Ghost King, I had never been more visible. "Sleep," Min-Soo commanded, though it sounded more like an invitation as he gestured toward the silk-covered bed. "Tomorrow, the market opens, and we are going to start the hostile takeover of everything you've ever lost." I didn't argue. I had made my trade. I had sold my soul to the only man who knew exactly what it was worth. The first rays of the soul sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sanctum. I hadn't slept. I had spent the remaining hours of the night memorizing the rhythmic patterns of Min-Soo's breathing and the silent language of his empire. When he finally moved, it wasn't with the grogginess of a man waking, but with the sudden, lethal alertness of a soldier returning to the front. He didn't say good morning. He walked to the safe hidden behind a panel of dark wood and pulled out a thick envelope and a heavy, matte black object. He tossed the envelope on the unmade bed beside me. "Your exit ticket," he said, his voice like velvet dragged over gravel. "A clean passport, 50,000 in cash, and a one-way ticket to Zurich. My people have already scrubbed your digital footprint from the SEC's primary servers. You can disappear, Patricia. You can be a ghost before Marcus Sterling even finishes his morning coffee."
I looked at the envelope, then up at him. He was standing by the window, the sunlight tracing the tattoos on his back, his posture dominant and still. He was giving me exactly what I had asked for when I walked into the Obsidian Gate. A way out. A chance to survive. I reached out, but I didn't take the cash. I took my lighter from the bedside table, flicked the flame to life, and touched it to the corner of the envelope. Min-Soo's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine surprise breaking through his unreadable mask. We watched in silence as the paper curled and blackened, the smell of burning ink filling the room. I dropped the flaming remnants into a crystal ashtray and met his gaze, my posture upright and unflinching. "I didn't spend the night proving I'm the smartest woman you've ever met just to run away with a suitcase full of hush money," I said, my voice steady and serious. "The Zurich version of Patricia Thompson is a victim. She's a woman who lost. I told you before, Min-Soo, I don't play games I can't win, and I haven't won yet." A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, one that held no warmth but a terrifying amount of respect. He walked back to the desk and picked up the two items he had placed there earlier, a titanium black credit card with no name on the front, and a sleek, compact semi-automatic pistol. He walked toward me, the air between us charging with that familiar heavy tension. He took my hand,
his grip firm and calloused, and pressed the card into my palm. "This card has no limit because my ambition has no limit," he whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from my ear. "It is linked to a shell company Marcus Sterling will never find. Use it to buy back your soul. Hire the best, bribe the rest, and bleed his stock price until he's begging for a severance package." Then he placed the cold weight of the gun on top of the card. My fingers instinctively curled around the grip. It felt heavy, final, and surprisingly natural. "In this," he continued, his gaze locking onto mine with a predatory intensity, "is for the moment Marcus realizes that a strategist with a grudge is more dangerous than a mafia boss with a hit list. In my world, dividends are paid in blood as often as they are in gold. If you're going to be my partner, you don't just manage the wealth, you defend the throne." I looked down at the tools of my new trade, the credit card to ruin him financially, and the steel to finish him if he dared to fight back. I wasn't the golden girl of Wall Street anymore. I was something much more lethal. "Consider the merger finalized," I said, my gaze dropping to his tattooed chest before rising back to his eyes. "What's the first order of business?" Min-soo reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a possessive slow motion. "We go to the office, not your old one, mine. We're going to show the world that Patricia Thompson didn't just survive the crash, she bought the market." I stood up, the red silk of my dress rustling against my legs, the gun tucked securely into the waistband. Marcus Sterling thought he had erased me. He was about to find out that when you liquidate a diamond, all you do is create 1,000 smaller, sharper edges, and with the Ghost King at my back, I was going to cut him to the bone. The black titanium card felt like a cold blade against my palm as I stepped into the lobby of the Pierre Hotel. I wasn't there for a room. I was there for a reckoning. According to the Shadow Ledger, my former junior analysts, the ones I had mentored and protected, were celebrating their promotions at an exclusive brunch hosted by Marcus. I didn't enter through the front. I was flanked by two of Min-soo's consultants, men who wore Italian suits like armor and carried an aura of quiet, impending violence. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The heavy thud of their footsteps behind me was the only soundtrack I needed. We reached the private dining room. I didn't knock. One of Min-soo's men placed a hand on the gilded handle and pushed, the double doors swinging open with a violent grace that silenced the room. There they were, Sarah, James, and Miller, the trio I had trained, now sipping mimosas paid for by the portfolio they had helped Marcus steal. They looked up, their faces transitioning from drunken laughter to sheet-white terror in a matter of seconds. "Patricia," Sarah stammered, her glass trembling. You shouldn't be here. Marcus said I was a ghost," I interrupted, my voice as smooth and lethal as the silk of my dress. I walked to the head of the table, the consultants fanning out behind me like shadows. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the white linen cloth. "But the thing about ghosts, Sarah, is that they see everything, especially the back doors you left in my algorithms to help Marcus siphon the Aegis Fund." "We didn't have a choice," Miller chirped, his voice cracking. "He threatened our licenses." I pulled the matte black pistol from my clutch and laid it on the table. The sound of the heavy metal hitting the wood was louder than a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating silence. I didn't point it at them. I didn't have to. The mere presence of Min-soo's brand of justice was enough to make the air thin. "You always have a choice," I whispered, my gaze locking on to each of them until they looked at the floor. "And today, the choice is simple. You can keep the titles Marcus gave you and spend the next 20 years in a federal cell when I leak the logs of your IP theft, or you can give me the encryption keys to the secondary server Marcus thinks I don't know about." James reached for his phone, perhaps to call Marcus, perhaps to call the police. One of the consultants moved with a speed that defied his size, his hand clamping down on James's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone against bone. James let out a stifled whimper, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Mr. Jinwoo doesn't like interruptions," the consultant murmured. I leaned closer to Sarah, the golden girl I had treated like a sister. "The keys, Sarah, now, or I let my associates explain to you what happens to people who try to short the Ghost King." Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely type on her laptop. But she did it. In less than 60 seconds, the secondary server was live on my tablet. I watched as 10 years of my life, my data, and my proprietary code streamed back into my possession, encrypted and wiped from the Sterling & Associates mainframe. "Good choice," I said, picking up the gun and sliding it back into my bag. I stood up, the power in the room shifting entirely toward me. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction, the kind of high no market rally could ever provide. "Liquidated," I replied, moving to the next target. Marcus Sterling thought he had taken my world. He didn't realize he had just given me a better one. I wasn't just reclaiming my data, I was reclaiming my throne, and with Min-Soo's muscular methods, I was finding that being the villain was a much more profitable investment than being the hero ever was. The transition from the street-level violence of reclaiming my data to the high-altitude silence of Min-Soo's private office felt like shifting from a brawl to a chess match. The tablet in my hand was now a fortress of information, containing the keys to the kingdom Marcus had tried to bury. But as I sat across from Min-Soo, watching him navigate a dozen encrypted screens, I noticed something that the Ghost King himself seemed to have overlooked. He was staring at a logistics map of his European holdings, his jaw tight, the tattoos on his neck appearing to pulse with his mounting frustration. "The Italians are squeezing the Mediterranean routes," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "They're intercepting the liquid assets before they can hit the offshore hubs. I've doubled the security details, but the money is still bleeding out." I didn't offer comfort. I didn't offer a drink. I stood up and walked behind his desk, leaning over his shoulder until the scent of his sandalwood cologne filled my senses. I reached out, my fingers hovering over his screen. "You're looking at this like a general, Min-Soo. You're trying to protect the convoys." "Because that's where the money is," he growled, though he didn't move away from my touch. "No," I said, my voice dropping into that clinical, rhythmic tone of a master analyst. "That's where the shadow of the money is. The Italians aren't stealing your cash. They're exploiting the lag in your currency conversion. Look at the timestamps on these transfers." I swiped a finger across his screen, pulling up the raw financial data he usually left to his underlings. I highlighted a recurring 3-second delay in his digital handshake with the Swiss banks. To a mafia boss, 3 seconds was nothing. To an investment strategist, 3 seconds was an eternity. "They've planted a ghost high-frequency bot in your routing server," I explained, my eyes tracking the flickering numbers with the speed of a predator. "Every time you move 10 million, they're skimming the fractional interest and the exchange rate variance. It looks like a rounding error on your end, but over a fiscal quarter, they've siphoned off nearly $80 million without ever touching a single one of your ships." Min-Soo froze. He looked at the screen, then back at me, his unreadable black eyes finally showing a flash of genuine realization. The Ghost King had been out-haunted by a line of code. "How do I kill it?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I replied, a slow, predatory smirk tugging at my lower lip. You don't kill it, you feed it. We're going to reroute the bot's outgoing pings into a dark pool I built back at Sterling. By the time the Italians realize they aren't skimming your interest anymore, they'll be accidentally funding our hostile takeover of Marcus's holding company. We're going to make your enemies pay for our wedding rings, Min-Soo. The tension in the room shifted instantly. It was no longer just about an alliance of convenience. It was a realization of total, lethal compatibility. Min-Soo stood up, turning to face me in the narrow space behind the desk. The power struggle that had defined our first encounter was still there, but it had evolved into something much more magnetic. He reached out, his large hand cupping the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the line of my ear with a possessive intensity. You brought me here because I thought you were a tool I could use to break Marcus, he whispered, his face inches from mine. I didn't realize I was bringing in the only person capable of fixing the cracks in my own foundation. I told you, I whispered back, my gaze steady and serious as I leaned into his touch. I'm not a pawn, and I'm certainly not a victim. I'm the greatest investment you've ever made.
He didn't pull away. He looked at me with a mix of hunger and respect that made the silk of my dress feel like it was catching fire. For the first time, the Ghost King looked like he was willing to share his throne. "Fix it," he commanded, though it sounded like a vow. "Fix the leak, and then we go after Marcus's primary account. If you can turn my enemy's greed into my capital, Patricia, I'll give you whatever you want." "I don't want whatever, Min-Soo," I said, my hand closing over the one he had on my neck, my fingers interlacing with his. "I want everything, and I want to watch Marcus's face when he realizes I'm the one who took it." In that moment, the merger was no longer just professional. It was a blood bond of brilliance and brutality. I turned back to the screens, my fingers flying across the keys as I began to liquidate the traitors and fortify the empire. Marcus Sterling had tried to erase me because he feared my mind. He should have feared my heart, because now it belonged to a man who gave me the power to burn his world to the ground. The predator's response to being cornered is rarely to surrender. It is to snarl. 2 days after I fixed the leak in Min-Soo's empire, my phone, the burner Min-Soo had provided, vibrated with a video call request. I was sitting in the back of a blacked-out SUV, the weight of the matte black pistol comforting against my thigh. I tapped the screen. Marcus Sterling's face filled the display, looking every bit the polished, silver-haired statesman of finance, but the slight twitch in his left eye told me he was hemorrhaging more than just data. "Patricia," he said, his voice forced into a paternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "I see you've found some aggressive new associates. I'm impressed. I always knew you had a spine, even if I had to break it to find it." "Skip the flattery, Marcus," I said, my voice as cold and rhythmic as the ticker tape. "The market opens in 20 hours. By the time the closing bell rings, your board of directors will have seen the logs of your offshore siphoning. You're overleveraged and underprotected." Marcus leaned back, a slow, ugly smirk spreading across his face. "Am I? You think a few leaked files will take me down? I've spent 30 years building this city, Patricia. I own the investigators you're planning to call. In fact, they're in my office right now." He turned the camera. 3 men in cheap suits sat around his mahogany table, looking over a stack of documents. "The FBI has opened an investigation into the Aegis Fund," Marcus continued, his tone turning sharp. "But they aren't looking at me. They're looking at the lead analyst who had sole access to the encryption keys, you. I've already submitted the evidence that you were working with an overseas criminal element, your new friend, Mr. Jinwoo, to launder billions.
If you don't come back to the office in the next hour and sign a confession stating this was all your doing, I'll ensure you spend the rest of your life in a supermax. I'll buy your silence one way or another." The air in the SUV grew heavy. It was a classic Marcus move, the manufactured crisis. He wasn't just trying to stop me, he was trying to buy me back into the fold so he could control the damage. Beside me, Min-soo's hand shifted. He hadn't said a word, but his presence was a dark, suffocating force. He took the phone from my hand, his gaze locking onto Marcus through the screen with a lethal intensity that seemed to vibrate through the airwaves.
"Marcus," Min-soo whispered, the name sounding like a death sentence. "You made a mistake when you tried to use my name to scare her. I don't negotiate with thieves, and I don't let people touch my investments." "Investments?" Marcus laughed, though it sounded brittle. "She's a diversity hire who got lucky with a few algorithms. You're playing with fire, Jin-woo." "No," I said, taking the phone back and leaning into the frame so Marcus could see the quiet defiance in my eyes. "I'm the fire, and you just gave me the one thing I needed to finish you, a motive. You think the FBI is yours? My algorithms didn't just track your money, Marcus. They tracked the IP addresses of the people you paid off. Every investigator in that room has a price tag, and I have the receipts." I disconnected the call before he could respond. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the hum of the engine as we wove through the city. "He's desperate," Min-soo said, his hand sliding over mine, his thumb tracing the line of my knuckles. "Desperate men are unpredictable. He'll try to move on you tonight." "Let him," I replied, my gaze fixed on the glowing New York skyline. "He thinks he's playing a game of leverage. He doesn't realize I've already shifted the portfolio. He's trying to buy back a woman who no longer exists. I'm not his analyst anymore. I'm the woman who's going to watch him lose everything." Min-soo pulled me closer, the heat of his body a silent vow of protection and partnership. The sexual tension between us was no longer just a spark. It was the steady burn of two predators preparing for the final kill. "The FBI investigation is a bluff," I continued, my mind already rerouting the plan, "but it gives us the perfect cover to execute the shadow merger. If he wants to talk to the feds, we'll give him the real ones, the ones he hasn't paid off yet." "Good," Min-soo murmured, his lips brushing against my temple. "Then we don't wait for the market to open. We break the market tonight." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of old money and new arrogance, but Min-soo and I arrived like a predator drone, silent, expensive, and targeted. This was the Metropolitan Charity Gala, the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, and Marcus Sterling was the guest of honor. He was there to auction off a collection of rare antiquities, a move designed to signal to the market that his liquidity was fine, that the FBI investigation was just a rumor. I wore a black silk gown that looked like liquid midnight, the diamond earrings Min-soo had given me catching the light like shards of ice. Beside me, Min-soo was a masterpiece of lethal sophistication. He didn't wear a tie. His suit was tailored to perfection, the top buttons open just enough to hint at the ink on his chest. We didn't walk into the room, we occupied it. The chatter died down as we moved toward the front. I felt the weight of 100 gazes, but my eyes were fixed on the stage where Marcus stood, his face freezing into a mask of pale fury as he spotted us. He hadn't expected me to show my face after his threat. He certainly hadn't expected me to be on the arm of the Ghost King. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his voice brittle in the sudden tension, "our final item of the evening, the Koryo Dynasty Celadon vessel, a piece of history, priceless in its heritage. We open the bidding at $5 million. $10 million. Marcus called out immediately from his front row table, his voice projecting a false bravado. He looked back at me, a smirk playing on his lips.
He was trying to show the room that he still held the purse strings.
20 million, I said, my voice low and steady, carrying through the ballroom with the rhythm of a closing bell. A ripple of murmurs broke out. Marcus's smirk faltered. He knew my bank accounts were frozen. He didn't know I was holding Min Su's black titanium card. 25, Marcus snapped, his posture stiffening. 50, Min Su countered. He didn't even look at Marcus. He was looking at me, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, his thumb tracing a slow, distracting circle against the silk. The room went silent. 50 million was more than the piece was worth. It was a statement of total war. Marcus's face turned a mottled shade of red. He was trapped. If he stopped, he looked weak. If he continued, he was bleeding cash he didn't have. 60 million, Marcus shouted, the desperation bleeding through his polished exterior. I leaned into Min Su, the heat of his body a sharp contrast to the cold calculation in my mind. He's over-leveraged, I whispered. One more push and his credit floor collapses. 100 million, I said, loud enough for the SEC plants in the back of the room to hear. Marcus surged to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. She's a fraud! Her accounts are under federal investigation. She doesn't have the funds. Min Su stepped forward, his presence expanding until the entire room seemed to shrink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, unbranded black card, laying it on the auctioneer's podium. The funds are mine, Min Su said, his dark baritone echoing like a threat. And Patricia Thompson is my partner. If you're questioning the validity of my credit, Marcus, perhaps we should discuss the validity of your offshore holdings in front of these fine people. The silence was absolute. Marcus looked around the room, realizing that the elite he had cultivated were already smelling the scent of a dying animal. He sat back down, his shoulders slumped, his empire beginning to crack under the weight of a price he couldn't pay. Going once, going twice, sold to Miss Thompson and Mr. Jinwoo, the auctioneer whispered, his gavel hitting the wood with the finality of a guillotine. I turned to Marcus, a slow, predatory smile touching my lips. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The look in his eyes told me the blood-stained ledger was no longer a secret. I had outbid him for the vessel, but more importantly, I had outbid him for his own reputation. As we walked out of the ballroom, the Celadon vessel was an afterthought. The real prize was the notification on my tablet. Marcus's primary lenders had just triggered a margin call. The hostile takeover hadn't just begun. It was already in its final, lethal phase. The Utagati he once thought would be his crowning achievement had become his editos, his very own Martindale. "You did well, Patricia," Min Su murmured as we reached the curb, the cool night air hitting my skin. He pulled me close, his gaze intense and unreadable. "You humiliated him in his own temple." "It was just an opening bid, Min Su," I replied, leaning into his strength. "Tomorrow, we liquidate the rest of him." The opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange sounded like a starter's pistol. I sat in Min Su's command center, the glow of 12 monitors reflecting in my eyes, my fingers hovering over the keys like a concert pianist preparing for a dark symphony. Marcus had survived the night, but he wouldn't survive the morning. "The margin calls hit his personal accounts at 9:30, I said, my voice steady, rhythmic, and devoid of mercy. "He's trying to liquidate his offshore reserves to cover the spread, but he doesn't realize I've already rerouted the liquidity gates." Min Su stood behind me, a silent shadow of power. He wasn't looking at the screens, he was looking at me, his hand resting on my shoulder, the heat of his palm grounding me as I prepared to pull the trigger. "And the physicals?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "His private vault in New Jersey is moving," I replied, pointing to a flickering red dot on a GPS map. "He's trying to move his hard assets, gold, bearer bonds, and the original ledgers to a secure location before the feds arrive. He thinks he's playing hide and seek." Min Su leaned down, his lips brushing my ear.
My crew is already in position. They won't find a secure location. They'll find a dead end. I turned back to the monitors and hit enter. The market crash didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a whisper. I released the deep dive report I'd spent the last 48 hours perfecting, a clinical, irrefutable dossier detailing Marcus's ghost accounts and the fraudulent inflation of the Aegis Fund. I didn't send it to the police. I sent it to every major short seller on the street. In seconds, the ticker for Sterling and Associates began to bleed. $142, $110, $85. It was a free fall. The golden girl was gone, replaced by an invisible executioner. I watched as billions of dollars in market cap evaporated in real time. Marcus was frantically buying his own stock to stabilize the price, but he was using the very money I had rerouted through the Italian bot. He was effectively paying me to destroy him. "He's desperate," I murmured, watching the trade volume spike. "He's emptying his last liquid reserve." "Let him," said Min-Soo, his grip on my shoulder tightening with a possessive pride. "Every dollar he spends trying to save his name is a dollar that ends up in our offshore accounts. You aren't just crashing his market, Patricia. You're absorbing it." Suddenly, my private line buzzed. It was a video feed from Min-Soo's lead enforcer. On the screen, Marcus's armored transport was boxed in on a lonely stretch of industrial road. The consultants I had seen at the hotel were moving with surgical precision, disarming the guards and seizing the black cases that contained the last of Marcus's physical wealth. I looked at the market ticker. $12.40. The trading was halted. The company was functionally dead. I leaned back in the chair, the adrenaline beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, clinical satisfaction. I had done it. I had taken the man who tried to erase me and turned him into a cautionary tale. I had used his own greed as the catalyst for his extinction. Min-Soo turned my chair around so I was facing him. The intensity in his eyes was staggering, a mix of predatory hunger and a profound respect that made my breath hitch. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his gaze lingering on my lips. "You didn't just execute a hit, Patricia. You orchestrated a masterpiece. The elite will be talking about this crash for a generation." "It wasn't for them, Min-Soo," I said, my hand rising to cover his, my fingers interlacing with the man who had given me the tools to reclaim my power. "It was for me and for you." "The market is closed," he murmured, his lips finally meeting mine in a kiss that tasted of victory and dark promise.
Marcus Sterling was currently sitting in a glass office that was no longer his, watching a screen that showed he was worth nothing. Meanwhile, I was in the arms of the only man who knew that my brilliance was the most valuable asset in the world. The crash was over, the takeover was complete, and the dividends were going to be spectacular. The smell of the Hudson River at midnight was a mixture of salt, diesel, and rot, the scent of things being discarded. I stood on the edge of Pier 42, the wind whipping my hair across my face, while the silence of the docks was broken only by the rhythmic lapping of black water against the rusted pilings. A silver Mercedes-Benz screamed around the corner of a warehouse, its tires screeching as it realized the only exit was blocked by two of Min-Soo's matte black SUVs. The car fishtailed to a halt, and Marcus Sterling stumbled out. He wasn't the polished statesman of finance anymore. His tie was gone, his shirt was stained with sweat, and he was clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a life preserver. He didn't see me at first. He only saw Min-Soo, who was leaning against the hood of the lead SUV, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, his posture as still and lethal as a coiled viper. "Going somewhere, Marcus?" Min-Soo's baritone carried over the wind, cold and mocking. "The market doesn't close for another few hours in Tokyo. I thought you'd want to watch the final liquidation." "Get out of my way, Jinwoo!"
Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with a desperation that tasted like victory. "I have offshore accounts you can't touch. I have friends in Washington. You're just a thug in an expensive suit." "He might be a thug," I said, stepping out from the shadows of the warehouse. I saw the moment Marcus's soul left his body. He froze, his eyes bulging as they landed on me. I wasn't wearing a gown anymore. I was back in a tailored suit, the matte black pistol heavy and certain in my hand. "But I'm the strategist who knows your friends just froze your passports." "Patricia," he gasped, his knees buckling. "Listen to me. I can give you half, more than half. Everything in this case, bearer bonds, titles to the European estates. It's yours. Just let me reach the boat." I walked toward him, my heels clicking on the damp concrete with the precision of a metronome. I didn't stop until the barrel of my gun was inches from his chest. "You still don't get it, Marcus. You think everything is a transaction. You think you can buy back the life you stole from me." I reached out and snatched the briefcase from his trembling hand. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew its value was zero compared to what I was holding in my other hand, a single notarized document. "This is the deed to your primary residence, the titles to your fleet, and the power of attorney over your remaining trusts," I said, my voice as rhythmic and clinical as the ticker tape that had ended him this morning. "Minsu's crew didn't just intercept your transport, they bought your debt. Every cent you owe to the people you betrayed is now owned by the Jinwoo Group. I don't want your money, I own your existence." Marcus looked from me to Minsu, realization finally dawning on him. He wasn't just bankrupt, he was a ward of the Ghost King. "You can't do this," he whispered, falling to his knees. "This is illegal. This is an ultimate divestment," I interrupted, leaning down so my face was inches from his. "You called me a diversity hire. You called me a girl who got lucky. Now you're a man who doesn't own the shoes on his feet. You're dismissed, Marcus, for cause." I turned my back on him, the ultimate insult to a man who lived for the gaze of the elite. I walked toward Minsu, who was watching me with an intensity that made the cold river air feel like a furnace. He reached out, his hand sliding around my waist, pulling me against his side. "Do you want me to finish it?" Minsu asked, his gaze drifting toward the kneeling figure of my former mentor. "No," I said, looking up into Minsu's unreadable black eyes. "Let him live. Let him watch from the gutter while we build the empire he thought he deserved. A quick end is a mercy he hasn't earned." Minsu nodded, a slow, predatory smirk touching his lips. He leaned down and kissed me, a hard, possessive claim that tasted of salt and power. Behind us, his enforcers moved in to escort Marcus to his new reality. As we walked back to the SUV, the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the New York skyline in shades of gold and blood. The portfolio was closed, the traitors were liquidated, and as Minsu closed the door, sealing us in the silent, expensive dark of the car, I knew the greatest investment of my life hadn't been the money or the revenge. It was the man beside me. "Where to now, Mrs. Kong?" he murmured, using the name for the first time. "To the office," I replied, leaning my head on his shoulder. "We have a world to rule." "You've done more than just reclaim a portfolio, Patricia," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a possessive slow motion. "You've built a bridge between my world and yours, a place where brilliance isn't just rewarded, but protected by fire." "It was the greatest investment of my life, Minsu," I said, leaning into him, my gaze serious and unwavering. "Not the money, not the revenge, but the moment I realized I didn't have to be twice as good for men who were half as capable. I just had to be myself, with a man who could handle the volatility." Minsu leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. The world thinks I'm the Ghost King. They think you're the Wall Street widow who got lucky. They have no idea that the real empire isn't in the ledgers or the territory. It's in the partnership, I finished for him. He kissed me then, a deep, certain claim that tasted of the future we had seized. In the distance, the lights of the city flickered, thousands of lives moving to the beat of the systems I had built and the power he maintained. We were the silent architects of a new era, a fusion of Nigerian resilience, Korean discipline, and a shared ruthlessness that the world would never see coming. My phone buzzed in my clutch, but I didn't reach for it. It was likely a notification from London or Tokyo, a new opening, a new opportunity. But for the first time in my life, the trade could wait. "Ready to go back inside?" Minsu asked, gesturing toward the gala where the elite of two worlds, the legitimate and the underground, waited to toast to our union. "The board is waiting for the CEO's opening remarks." "I've kept them waiting long enough," I said, sliding my hand into his, our fingers interlacing perfectly. As we walked back through the glass doors, leaving the skyline behind, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The past had been liquidated, the debts were paid in full, and the dividends were finally ours to keep. I was Patricia Thompson Jinyu, and I had finally found the one market that never crashed.